Hi, and welcome to the Literature Lab, where you learn to read texts and write arguments like a literary critic. That means you read for details, quote texts with integrity, develop ideas into arguments, and use the right language. I'm Michael Ullyot from the Department of English at the University of Calgary. Our first video was a top 10 list of common grammar mistakes to help you avoid errors when you write. There's a link to it below. In today's video, we're going to step back and review a fundamental skill of literary analysis, how to move from reading a text to writing about it. The process of generating ideas from texts and organizing your ideas into arguments has 4 stages. First, annotate. Second, think. Third, filter. And fourth, summarize. In stage 1, you read and annotate your text. In stage 2, you stop and think about what you've read and you generate ideas about it. In stage 3, you organize those ideas and you filter out the weak ones. Finally, in stage 4, you summarize the strong ideas into arguments. This video will take you through these 4 stages, but we won't just talk about them, we'll practice them on a real text, a short poem by Dylan Thomas. But first, it's important to understand that this isn't a straightforward linear process. It's not a checklist. It's better to think of it as a cycle. Writing about literature is more dynamic than a checklist because you repeat stage 1, reading, multiple times during stage 2, thinking, just as you repeat stage 2 during stage 3, filtering. Why is that? Because your interpretation of a text has got to be supported by evidence from the text. So you need to read the text more than once, particularly after you have an idea of your argument, in order to find the best evidence for that argument. You know that you're finished when you're satisfied that you've found the best evidence for your argument. So, in this video, we'll cover how to read and annotate to generate ideas. Then, how to figure out which ideas can work together to build arguments. And finally, how to summarize, organize, and make those arguments. I love books, particularly old ones. It's an occupational hazard. But aside from a few rare exceptions, books are not precious. Ideas are more precious than the paper and cloth and glue and dead trees that are holding them together. So, if you learn only one thing from this video, let it be this: annotate your books. Emphasis on your, by the way. Don't write in library books. That's just wrong. Why do you need to annotate books? Because interpretations are essentially readings. They are your reading of the text, which means your rearrangement of words from the text. You'll find connections between different parts of the text, and you'll describe those connections. You'll argue that they matter, that they are more than just coincidences. But readings begin with notes, with you recording your impressions of what's interesting or important at the word and sentence level. By the time your eye has traveled all over a page, it should leave visible traces in pen all over that page. Summarize ideas or events, ask questions, note words to look up in a dictionary, note patterns and conflicts and unexpected words and repetitions. Don't worry about getting it right at this stage. In a moment, I'll give you some categories of things to look for. With time, you can develop your own annotation style and system. But be flexible. Each time you read a text, you should notice different features. Try changing your pen color for a second reading. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to take you through my reading of a short poem, In My Craft or Sullen Art, by the early 20th century Welsh poet Dylan Thomas. Its subject is why Thomas writes poetry, but I chose it because it shows you some of the more important features to annotate when you read anything. Not only poetry, but also short stories, novels, plays, anything you read for its literary value. And because no one text can possibly cover every kind of feature, follow the link below for my guide to close reading, which just means reading in order to notice details. Before I begin the first reading, I'm going to read you the poem, and then I'll show you 6 categories of things to look for in a text like "In my craft or sullen art." In my craft or sullen art, exercised in the still night, when only the moon rages and the lovers lie abed with all their griefs in their arms, I labor by singing light, not for ambition or bread or the strut and trade of charms on the ivory stages, but for the common wages of their most secret heart. Not for the proud man apart from the raging moon I write on these spindrift pages, nor for the towering dead with their nightingales and psalms, but for the lovers, their arms round the griefs of the ages, who pay no praise or wages, nor heed my craft or art. The first thing you can look for is the form of the poem. That means the external shape. And the first distinction to make is whether it is poetry or prose. Of course, if it's a poem, then it is poetry. And prose just means a line that goes to the end and then wraps just with the limitations of the width of the page. But in this case, you have a poem that is ending earlier than the line itself, or the white space ends, and that means that the poet has deliberately created a new line in all these places. If it's poetry, are all of its lines of uniform length? In this case, some of them look a bit longer, but if you actually count the syllables and the lovers lie abed with all their griefs in their arms, both of them actually have 7 syllables, and so some of them may look longer, but they are in fact the same number of syllables. We're not doing any annotation yet, so let's start there. We look at the last words of each line, and you can start to notice that they're not really rhyming with each other for a long time, not until you get to words like arms and charms, and stages and wages here at the end, and finally heart and art at the beginning. So you can draw out what's called the rhyme scheme, and the way you do that is by giving each line a letter, and the letter designates what other lines it rhymes with. And it is in fact not until you get to quite a ways down this poem, A, B, C, D, E, finally then you get a B, because night and light rhyme with each other. And you continue in that fashion to write the scheme of the entire stanza. And that's how you annotate form. The next thing to look for is the structure of a poem or any text that you're looking at. And the first thing you can do in this poem is you can notice that it is, of course, in 2 separate sections called stanzas. We're going to break these 2 stanzas down, in fact, and look at what their meaning is, if we can paraphrase it in plain English. We really shouldn't try to capture everything when we're annotating in this way. Just try to summarize how the meaning or the argument is developing. In this case, we have 2 separate sentences in 2 separate paragraphs. We have only periods at the ends of those sections, which are called stanzas when you're talking about poetry. In my craft or sullen art exercised in the still night, when only the moon rages and the lovers lie abed with all their griefs in their arms, I labor. Labor is the verb of that first sentence. I labor by singing light, not for ambition or bread, or the strut and trade of charms on the ivory stages, but for. So we have not for and but for connecting with each other, because I labor for whom? For the common wages of their most secret heart. The question then is, who does their refer to? And if you reread it, the there actually refers to the lovers. The lovers, I labor for the lovers, not for other things, but for the wages of their heart. And in the second stanza, you have a very similar structure. Not for the proud man apart, nor for the towering dead, but for the lovers. There they are again. Their arms round the grief of the ages, who pay no praise or wages, nor heed. We have nor repeated. And so you can see that you have here, as I said, 2 sentences, and they are divided by whom the poet does not labor for in his craft or sullen art, and who he does labor for, the common wages of their secret heart, and for the lovers.
The third thing that we'll look for in our poem is the mood. And this is where having a good plain English paraphrase is really important. So it's important that we understand what's happening in this poem. Again, it doesn't have to be the entire meaning of every single word, but it has to capture the way that you would say the kinds of things that this poem is saying. Does the speaker express emotions or other states of mind? What kind of tone is he or she going to use? In my craft or sullen art, exercised in the still night, when only the moon rages and the lovers lie abed with all their griefs in their arms, has a feeling of someone who's isolated, who's writing in the still night, and the mood is of being separate from people like the lovers. So we might write a word that helps to capture the sort of distance that the poet is feeling. I labor by singing light, apart from these people. And he's trying to write for the common wages, which is just a word that means the rewards or the outcomes of their most secret heart of the lovers. He also has a feeling of distance from the lovers who he's trying to connect with, really. So this is or another word that we could write is he's trying to connect with the lovers. But he's also separate and distant from the proud man, the towering dead, etc. So again, we have a distance and a distance again, but then a connection, but for the lovers with whom he is trying to connect. And yet they are also isolated or distant from him. So there's another connection, or rather another repetition at the end. There's this feeling of the mood has become sort of wistful, like he is far away from those with whom he is trying to connect. The fourth thing that we're going to look for with a new colored pen is the sound. That is, the sound of the exact words in this text. Now remember, the author chose each one of these words on purpose, not just to say a thing, not just for us to paraphrase it, but for us to notice how they say it, to compel us to read and to hear this arrangement of these particular words. So let's look specifically at repetitions in Dylan Thomas's poem, first at the letter level and then at the word level. Now, repeated letters are called alliteration. There aren't a lot of repeated letters in this poem, but if you consider a line like Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, the line, "From forth the fatal loins of these two foes," that's alliteration because the letter F gets repeated so many times. Here you have a few repetitions, like with the lovers lying abed, with the other line here about how they pay no praise or wages. The other place you might have it, it's slightly less strong, is the strut and trade of charms. There's a lot of repetitions here of individual sounds that seem important or significant and certainly make it more melodious. But let's look at the repetitions of words instead of letters. The repetitions of words, of course, we've already noticed with the rhyme scheme, the repetition of rhyming actual words. And you have words like art and art at the beginning. In fact, you have craft and art repeated at the beginnings and at the ends of the entire poem, which of course is part of the whole structure, or rather the theme of the whole poem, is that he is writing his poetry alone. You have a couple of other words that get repeated, like, for example, the moon rages gets repeated down here with the raging moon. You also, of course, have the most important word in the poem getting repeated, and that is the lovers, who get repeated down here. Lovers. We're starting to annotate a lot of things about these lovers, and you can start to see how significant they are. They're lovers with their arms round the griefs of the ages. And here, of course, the lovers are lying abed with all their griefs in their arms. So repetitions of words can start to tell you, of course, what the most important words are in a poem, because if a poet is repeating them, then they are necessarily calling our attention to them. Remember, finally, that a word like wages, which is another one that gets repeated, is a word that we don't use in this particular way quite so often. It can mean, of course, wages in the sense of a monetary reward that you get, but can also mean something like that is a more immaterial reward or a compensation for a thing that you do. So looking up words like wages in the dictionary can be very helpful. The fifth feature of the text that we'll look at is the language. And specifically, we're going to start with the syntax or the word order. Necessarily, poetry is going to mix up the standard word order of things so that it can achieve its poetic effect. But if you particularly look at lines like, "Not for the proud man apart from the raging moon, I write," Dylan Thomas here is leaving the verb or the core, the sort of sentence and or rather subject and verb of this sentence all the way to the end of it. Not for this I write, nor for that, but for the lovers. If we were to say this in modern English, in common English, we would say, I write not for the proud man, or I do not write for the proud man, apart from the raging moon. So syntax can tell you that it's the one way that the poet is achieving their effect. Another is the diction, and that means the word choice, the author's choice of words. Are there any words, for example, that strike you as particularly unexpected or strange? Are any of the words in this poem having multiple meanings that we could examine? When you're looking at the diction or the word choice of a word like ivory, ivory means the sort of thing that is quite rare and valuable. It's like a precious object or precious material. But common is deliberately chosen in the next line in order to contrast with it. He's not looking for precious things, charms on the ivory stages, but rather instead for the common wages. Wages is another word, by the way, that is very important for us to note because it comes up here and again at the end. That's the thing that the poet is pursuing. He's not only repeating it, but he's making a particular choice. It's good for us to look at, in the Oxford English Dictionary, at the meanings of words like wages. Another one that I found helpful was to look up the word spindrift, which means things that are expelled or rather sprayed, and it's usually water that gets sprayed. And it's probably connected to the moon in the line above. So that's a word choice whose meaning is important. The moon, of course, is what governs the tides, which makes waves flow. And then the other word that I noticed here were these choices of words, the diction here of nightingales and psalms, which are the sorts of things that the towering dead poets are writing about. They're writing about nightingales. They're writing psalms. Those are famous subjects for poetry. Finally, the word that we should probably note as an important one that repeats, and so is the word griefs. The lovers have their arms round the griefs of the ages. The lovers lie abed with all their griefs in their arms, and this is a very pivotal word in this poem. It connects to the feeling that the lovers have of the limitations of their time together. And finally, the sixth thing that we'll look for in this poem are the comparisons. There are two main categories of comparisons. The first is metaphors. My love is a rose. The second is similes, which are just explicit metaphors that use the word like or as. My love is like a rose. There are no similes in Dylan Thomas's poem because the word like or as doesn't appear. But there are a number of metaphors right from the start. For example, the idea that I write poetry is what he's saying. He's using the word craft to mean the metaphor of poetry or of writing. You also have this unusual word, spindrift pages, a metaphor there, which means this is where looking up the word can be very helpful, that the pages are almost spraying out of him in some natural process, like the spray of a wave. I've jumped over this one here. The moon is raging. And there's a metaphor for the kind of connection that has been traditionally made between the moon and madness. You think about the word lunatic or lunacy. You think of Shakespeare's line, the lunatic, the lover, and the poet. It's only the moon that's raging, not the poet. So he is not raging. In fact, he's laboring by singing light, which is a lot more rational sounding. The light of the moon is singing in that way. It's not that he is raging. He's not writing for people who are apart from the raging moon as well. And finally, the word bread here in this line is a metaphor for rewards of various kinds, but usually meaning financial. So there are a whole range of metaphors in this poem that we should be annotating.
The second stage is to come up with some ideas about why all of those words are there in the poem. What are they doing together? What is it that makes them interesting? At this stage, they may only seem interesting to you, but don't let that hold you back. In later stages, you will work on persuading other people that they're interesting. In this stage, you're still paraphrasing the poem, but now you're thinking about what the ideas are doing there together. So let's try think aloud based on In My Craft or Sullen Art. So when I read this poem, the first way that I begin is to ask why the word sullen appears in the very first line, because the other words seem just fine to me. Initially, the poet is setting up a contrast between, a couple of contrasts, between the way that the moon is raging, despite the stillness of the night, and also that the lovers are in bed with their griefs in their arms. And a moon, the still night and the raging moon and the lovers who are nonetheless grieving seem to be at odds with each other. The next is to try to figure out how these things are establishing a setting or a context for the poet's labors. So that's happening at night while the lovers are lying in bed together. And now we've established that context, and a list begins, a list of the things that the poet doesn't try to address or doesn't pursue or want. First of all, the thing he doesn't want is earthly kinds of rewards, like the ambition or the bread or the charms or the stages and so on. This is all still in the first stanza. It feels like perhaps he's either been rejected by these things, he's pursued them and not been able to achieve them, or because his vocation as a poet somehow just doesn't reward him in these ways. Skipping over a couple lines, you can see in the next stanza, at the beginning of that stanza, he's also not writing or pursuing for these other people, for this proud man apart from the raging moon, for example. Also for the towering dead who are writing other things, the sort of famous poets of the past. But again, he goes back to the lovers. So if he's writing for the lovers, going back to the first stanza, you can see that he's writing for them and specifically for the common wages of their most secret heart. Now those are pretty important lines. Let's try to figure out what exactly he means by them. Somehow he is writing for the reward of that heart. That's one of the meanings of wages. It doesn't just mean financial compensation. And it's a secret heart because if you look that up in the Oxford English Dictionary, you can see that it has not just the meaning of a thing that you don't tell people, but also a thing that you conceal, and you almost keep something that you only know yourself, but it might also be a part of you that you don't want to really address or acknowledge that you have inside your heart. That does kind of help to explain a little bit why at the end of the poem he says that the lovers pay no praise or wages, there's that word again, nor heed my craft or art. In other words, they are ignoring him. They're not heeding him. They're not paying attention to him. They are not paying him praise or wages or rewards or giving him any compensation or any reaction at all. And so I have to ask, wonder there, why they ignore him. What would the reward or compensation or return actually be for the poet if they did heed him? It wouldn't be for praise or wages, but it would be for what he calls earlier the common wages. And if we look up wages in the dictionary, in the Oxford English Dictionary, we see that it means a whole host of things like outcomes and results, effects of a cause. The line, for example, the wages of sin is death, from the Bible, means that the outcome or the effect of sin. So wages of their secret heart somehow is, I don't know, is it understanding? Is it describing their griefs? Are those griefs, he says that the griefs are of the ages, meaning somehow that they are timeless and that they're universal. So in a way, it makes sense that they wouldn't heed him. There's something about the griefs that they don't want to face. By the end of stage 2, you should have a page full of notes. Stage 3 is about connecting ideas in those notes together and figuring out if they fit with each other or if they compete with each other. Do some of those ideas lead to other ideas? If you were describing them to a friend, which idea would you start with? This third stage is filtering and organizing, which is the beginning of making an argument. You will certainly need to reread the text again or to review your annotations to decide which of these ideas you can carry forward to the next stage, but this is the time when you reject the weak ideas in favor of the strong. So now let's return to the lovers. Why is it that they don't want to heed the poet? It's somehow not like the earthly rewards that the poet is rejecting or that maybe reject him, things like money and fame and pride, but somehow that facing what he calls the grease of the ages would be too difficult for them. It would somehow contravene or resist the lovers' desire to love each other in the time that they have together in what he calls this still night, when only the moon rages. And it goes on, because it changes so continuously. That's a phrase, by the way, about the raging moon, which repeats in the next stanza, so it's got to be important. If we look up rage in the Oxford English Dictionary, we see that it has the usual meanings we'd expect, like madness and insanity, but also somehow the intensity of nature, a raging storm, for instance, or the intensity of passion, a raging appetite, or of pain, a raging fever. So if we keep returning to repeated words or phrases, I'm going to do that and look at my annotations again. The raging moon is ignored only by the proud man. Why is he proud? He's apart from this moon because he somehow can't, like the lovers, or he won't acknowledge that time changes everything. That's why he's proud. The lovers, meanwhile, have each other in their arms, so they also can't or won't heed the art of the poet. And that brings us back to the very first line and the first word I noticed, sullen. Again, a word that if you look up in the Oxford English Dictionary, it means that it's both mournful and stubborn at the same time. It's opposing some prevailing moods or desires like love or pride. And so at last we come to stage 4. At this stage you ask yourself, so what? Why are these ideas connected? Why do they matter? What's the big picture here? You're moving toward a thesis statement, a statement that summarizes your argument in 1 or 2 sentences, usually 1. You should expect to write and rewrite this thesis statement a dozen times before you get it right. It's a lot more than a statement of facts. It's a statement of claim. It says things that someone else might disagree with, and it's both your starting point and your ending point of literary analysis. So let's try some summarizing based on what ideas we have filtered out of our thinking stage. This is the culmination of those preceding stages. The first draft that I'd offer of my thesis statement would be something like this. The poet writes poetry about truths that people would rather ignore. There's something about that draft that doesn't quite satisfy me. It's not saying enough about what it is about those truths. So let's add an example, and let's add that idea of stubbornness into the thesis statement, because we want a single statement that's going to encapsulate the whole complexity and depth and range of this argument. So here's the second draft. Poetry stubbornly insists on writing about truths, like the effects of time, that pride and love prevent people from seeing. You see here that I've elaborated and I've added some detail, not too much, but just enough to say the words pride and love. Those are really important as the ways or the things that get in the way that impede people's ability to see the truths about how time changes all things, for example. But I'm still not satisfied because there's something in this second draft that isn't really elaborating or isn't really pointing at what it is that the poem itself says in its word choices that really help to make this argument as complicated as it is. So here's a third draft. Poetry is a sullen art, in quotations, because it stubbornly writes about secret truths, like the ravages of time, that pride and love allow readers to ignore. Now, we're getting a little more detailed here about who these people are and how it is that their pride and love is getting in their way. They're actually readers, and they're not looking at what they're supposed to. I've also put in a couple of quotations here just to prime the pump, or to point toward a couple of moments in the poem when you can really see that I'm going to have to do some analysis. In other words, this is close reading of actual words in the poem. It's not a perfect thesis, but it's getting us a lot closer to the ideal thesis. And this is a process that you will build on over successive drafts. So let's review. You've begun by annotating your text, looking for 6 features: its form, its structure, its mood, its sound, its language, and its comparisons. You've then looked at all of those annotations, and you've thought about them by looking at how the different parts work together while not trying to account for everything. You've filtered those notes by thinking about how they're connected to each other and how you can build them into an argument which you then summarize in a very succinct and well-expressed thesis statement. The thesis is one of the 5 features that all literary analysis is aiming for. Literary analysis makes interpretive claims that are debatable, that are supported with evidence from the text, which you've gathered in your annotations, that together argue for a thesis about the text, and that explore the complexity of the text. That's it for this video. In the next video, we will turn to how it is that you make an argument with that textual evidence, and how you ensure that your citation systems are going to always account for the way that you have taken words of other people in making your own arguments.